Really excited to have Peter Baye visiting us today. Peter Baye has a long history of working on tidal marsh restoration projects in the North Bay and Sassoon Marsh, and I think has learned a lot over his years of experience that will be relevant to us. A little bio that I stole from San Francisco State. Peter has studied coastal habitats since 1975. He received his PhD in plant sciences from the University of Western Ontario, Canada in 1991. He's worked on regulatory wetland restoration projects at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and endangered species planning and regulation at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, specializing in large-scale regional planning. He's currently an independent consulting plant ecologist, specializing in endangered species recovery, wetland restoration, invasive plant management, and native vegetation management. So let's all welcome Peter. Thank you.
Thanks. I wanted to explain the origins of the talk and maybe excuse the talk a little bit. I taught a short course at San Francisco State's Romberg Center. I see Mike Baye is here. He's my sponsor for that that brief outing. A course in Bay Area wetland restoration. Karen was one of the students in that class, and I had a very brief section in wetland monitoring to go with all of the sort of project-driven anecdotes, long anecdotes about wetland restoration experiences. And she asked me to see if I could weave that into a brown bag talk, which I thought would be sort of a, graduate student beer hall, small, intimate thing. Now I realize it's an actual seminar program, so I tried to rapidly elaborate the talk. I probably have elaborated it too much. I have quite a lot of slides. So the more we can get it to back to a dialogue in a small, intimate way, the better for me. So feel free to raise your hand or interrupt or ask for clarification, with the understanding that I have way too many slides and will probably talk too fast. So what I'm not going to be doing is trying to give a sort of a monographic view of wetland restoration monitoring or hold up paradigmatic examples of good wetland restoration monitoring plans or point to pitfalls. What I want to try to do is highlight some of my professional experiences with, and sometimes frustrations with monitoring, seeing what the difference between what it can be and what it actually is, and try to encourage it to evolve from the era where I got my start, which is that the permit-driven era of wetland regulation, where permit compliance and project performance were pretty much the gold standard, mostly for smaller projects. I lived through the era of expansion of wetland restoration projects to these large-scale regional projects. And I noticed that there is still a lot of inertia. This is going to be a repeated theme in the talk. There's a lot of inertia. There are lag effects that are both institutional. Some might even be subconscious about how we view what proper monitoring is. It, again, originates from this very early era of evaluation, grading, proving that you've delivered what you're supposed to deliver, orientation for early wetland restoration monitoring that was actually formalized. I worked with Molly Martindale at the Corps of Engineers in the early 90s when she came up with the first standardized guidelines for what every monitoring plan should have. And I think even if that is no longer actively used, there may be later generations of it. I think that same approach of wanting to standardize things and have it be something you can use as a template to prove quality control, which is sort of a Corps of Engineers engineering stamp of approval. I think that still is with us, and it can be limiting for how we can learn. The other end of the spectrum, of course, is research, and of course, a lot of project-oriented monitoring and resource agencies don't want to go towards research, but somewhere in between, something that should be in that realm of adaptive management is where you can integrate the ability to show that your project is performing and natural resources are being managed properly, while you're also learning and applying the most invaluable lessons, which may not be based on your goals and objectives. Two examples for the cover. One is Montezuma Wetlands. Montezuma Wetlands is one of the largest wetland restoration projects of its decade, which is the 1990s. That's in your domain in Sassoon Marsh, and it's a good illustration of a project that came into conception and permits in one era and is still waiting to be breached. It's getting closer, but it's a good illustration of that lag. I mean, its design, permitting, planning, and monitoring is definitely mid-90s, and that's definitely the permit era. At the other end, Sears Point, which was just breached, much more rapid planning and evolution period. And this kind of illustrates, juxtaposing these, that lag is not just a metaphor, it's a real thing. And a lot of our project planning is a mix of kind of cutting-edge adaptive management-oriented science informed by current research and stuff that we've inherited from quite a while back. I'll do a little bit of historical context. Again, I kind of bridge different eras from my point for this slide is to show that the earliest stages of monitoring and reporting were based on that first generation of San Francisco estuary restoration projects, which were pretty much driven by permits, particularly BCDC's McAteer-Petrus Act and the Endangered Species Act, to show that you were compensating for impacts, sort of a quid pro quo, offsetting impacts, compensatory mitigation. And most of the methods at that time, which drove the monitoring, were placement of dredge material. They were an offshoot of the East Coast Corps of Engineers Dredge Materials Management Program, which is to find a benevolent place to put dredge material. So a lot of the monitoring was focused on sediment accretion, reaching target elevations, errors of tolerance, and showing that you have vegetation cover. Just, you know, the most rudimentary kind of ecology. Second generation, this is about coinciding with the earliest stages of articulating standard monitoring plans. This is the era of where the Goals Project, the San Francisco Bay Estuary Wetland Habitat Goals Project, was starting to get coalitions of scientists to articulate what the next vision should be for restoration. This also informed monitoring. This is an era where geomorphic processes as well as some ecological processes began to dawn into consciousness and began to get incorporated to some extent in monitoring plans. And now we're at a point where we're dealing with very changed baseline conditions. This is the Goals Project and Goals Project Update era, where the backdrop for monitoring plans is a sea change in sea level rise acceleration. Still hasn't kicked in the West Coast, but we are above all of the late Holocene average rates. We are undergoing step changes in sediment supply, going from transport-limited sediment supply to restoration sites to supply limitation. And we're now experiencing at an accelerating rate climate event extremes, including El Niños that cause very rapid short-term increases in sea level that are coming at a greater pace and greater magnitude. And these are affecting restoration projects right now. There are also advances in wetland sciences that are changing the way we understand the past, the norm. Most of restoration projects in the last decade or two have been based on historical ecology, a documentary record that extends about 150 years. That was considered the baseline for, or the standard for design for restoration projects, and our monitoring, often intentionally or not, was based on gathering data to show how closely or how faithfully you replicated those presumed historical conditions or natural conditions. We now have an expanded view of the past that really has not yet been incorporated in our goal setting or monitoring methods for monitoring plans for restorations. Examples of particular projects, I'm putting these on the list so you can see where they go in their histories. I'll be referring to a few. The first generation marsh restorations, dredge material placement, the ones from the 70s. Two examples are Pond 3 Alameda, which was a Corps of Engineers project that also gave us not the hybrid Spartina, but the original Spartina alterniflora that was the parent of the hybrid complex that is all through the Bay. And Muzzy Marsh, one of the first restoration projects, now about 40 years old. These are the most mature restoration projects we have, and they provide some instructive background on what we missed with monitoring. The second generation of San Francisco Estuary Marsh restoration includes Sonoma Baylands, Corps of Engineers project at the mouth of the Tidal River, Hamilton Wetland Restoration, Montezuma Wetlands, again, all 90s era. And in many ways, again, jumping to one of my conclusions later, in many ways, these are the products of lessons learned that did not come from the monitoring of that first generation. They were learned indirectly from stuff that escaped monitoring because some of those early projects had unexpected outcomes. And the monitoring plans were adapted to what they expected, what the predictions were, rather than alternative hypotheses. And our current generation, there's a much longer list. There's the proliferation of large-scale projects. A few I'll point to, Sears Point, I'll be referring to. That's also next to Sonoma Baylands at the mouth of the Tidal River. Arambaroo Island, which is actually more of a shoreline project having to do with erosion control that's related to marshes. Cullinan Ranch and Oraloma. Those are looking at variations of marsh restorations along the estuary that are a little sort of off-brand. They're not tidal marsh, not all of them are tidal marsh platforms. Some of them are now shifting to emphasis of restoration along the edges of the estuary, fringing marsh and the supertidal transition zones above them, partly a response to increasing emphasis of sea level rise and sea level rise adaptations. So there's greater diversity of marsh types, greater diversity of the methods by which we restore them, and there should, therefore, I suggest, be a greater diversity of the monitoring plans that capture the information they generate. But we haven't quite seen that yet. Again, to reiterate briefly, the origins of monitoring and the emphasis of monitoring in the 80s had to do with permit compliance. It was performance monitoring. The landscape context was very limited. The restoration site itself was the universe of monitoring. Most of the restoration projects were within breached dikes, and monitoring drops off beyond the edge of that dike. They're largely marsh platform monitoring programs. Edges, you might get just to the high tide line, but the universe sort of falls away. We now understand, of course, that the environmental settings very strongly influence the restoration sites and vice versa. Now that we're working at a much larger scale of restoration, the restoration sites themselves are changing both the physical and biological environment that they're placed in. So yes, a few slides I'll be showing in a second have to do with the fact that, again, our assumptions about the way these marshes evolve is not just mirrors, but guides the way we construct monitoring plans. So we have simplifying assumptions, engineering assumptions, so we can build restoration sites. That tends to simplify the monitoring, but also can constrain the range of phenomena that we can detect with them. And most important is you'll see all of the early monitoring plans from up through the 90s and early 2000s have deterministic assumptions. They are based on linear processes, progressive change with the idea of alternate ecosystem states or ecosystems that alter their trajectories, get stuck in another mode, or switch back. That really wasn't part of the science, nor was it part of the understanding of the deep past of marsh restoration then. Again, we had the limitation of that 150 years historical ecology model. So a lot of the monitoring is based on assumptions of simple progressive change. And I think I'll skip ahead because I'm going to slow down. Some of the uncertainties of restoration now, of course, we're starting to see in the evolution of those second-generation projects, and there are a lot of surprises in the little twists and turns they take. Some of the changes that we see in restoration sites are not anomalies, but are part of the pattern and process of marsh evolution affected by events, not progressive, linear, predictable changes, but stochastic processes. El Nino event, major floods, prolonged droughts that temporarily shift extremes of salinity or the timing of rainfall that plants have their seedlings germination cued to, that can leave imprinted effects on the way marshes evolve. We've seen a couple of these. In the 90s, we had a long drought. We had the historical El Nino event of 97, 98, and now we're coming out of another drought, all of which are leaving their imprints on these restoration projects, not necessarily the monitoring plans. Storm events, rapid invasions. In fact, some of our projects are actually triggering invasions of species. Some restoration projects are not just set up to detect, mapping invasive species coming into the sites. Some projects are actually generating populations of invasive species, but because that's not permitted, we're not really setting our monitoring plans up to detect the invasions that we actually generate. Restoration as an engine for invasion is not something that's seeped into consciousness. So this is kind of new stuff. This is in the last decade. Certainly, David Shellhammer's work on changed sediment regimes in the North Bay. This is something, again, that is not, it's there in the science, but not yet there in monitoring plans. And I'll give a couple of examples that really haven't gone anywhere because they haven't been monitored or reported, but even pre-project site water management causing irreversible soil and substrate changes to restoration sites that affect the outcomes. These are uncertainties that have not yet made it into the norms of monitoring. Ecological surprises is sort of the overriding theme of what I think monitoring needs to incorporate. We're good at a lot of experience reporting what we expect and reporting how well we're meeting standards. We are not good at keeping track of the unexpected. This is, I'll show you a few slides from PWA's Tidal Marsh Restoration Guidelines, which is kind of the state of the science from about up to 2004, which encapsulates a vast body of very valuable professional and scientific restoration experience, primarily in the South Bay and North Bay. That's based on tidal breaching, sedimentation, and achieving accreting marsh platforms. And again, it kind of illustrates the underlying assumptions of the way marshes forms and how it affects monitoring. Again, it's sort of a linear process where you have a progressive change, asymptotic, declining over time, of suspended tidal sediment accretion to critical thresholds of ecological change. This is sort of the textbook approach where you breach, mud comes in, it accretes faster, slows down, you reach a target elevation, that becomes the threshold that you monitor for, and then you're supposed to reach a dynamic equilibrium where you don't really have to monitor that much anymore because you've reached that steady state. That's the simplifying assumption. And there are nuances for it. Here's another model showing the relationship between ground surface elevation and time since breaching and how different suspended sediment concentrations can alter that trajectory. But again, all a very predictable, more or less linear process. And some of the perturbations, very few identified, like wave energy, that can change the rate or the timing of the process, but they're all sort of driving towards equilibrium. This dictates what you should be monitoring: wave energy, suspended sediment concentration, and accretion. But it's all based on the assumption that all you need to generate is a marsh plane. There's nothing about the edge. There's nothing about horizontal change. There's nothing about biological diversity. There's nothing about the processes that drive restoration other than suspended sediment deposition, and to some extent, slides I'm not showing things like channel formation. But here's the long-term reality. Those models are based on, say, 20 or 30 years of breach dike restoration projects. Here's some of the more recent research about the actual South Bay salt marshes that formed on their own, showing that one of the simplifying assumptions we have about linear change and progressive succession just are not true. If you look at these cores by Elizabeth Watson, University of California, Berkeley, who was working under Roger Byrne, she did marsh sediment cores all through the South Bay after about a decade of work in the North Bay. I'll show you a few of those in a sec. But no one had looked at the ages of marshes in the South Bay. It turns out they're not very old. Most are just a few hundred years old. The oldest maybe get to 1500. And they have a very unsteady history. You can see the bottom of the cores are just like restoration sites, a lot of rapidly accreted bay mud. Some of them go through typical succession where it's low marsh, cord grass, and then you see the evolution to high marsh. And you see it flip back to low marsh. And sometimes it flips back to high marsh and then low marsh. Unsteady state, non-equilibrium conditions, fluctuating or alternative stable states. By stable, I mean persistent. These cores reflect hundreds of years. One of the other findings they had that should be relevant to monitoring is that many of the marshes we have appear to be, like other salt marshes in Europe and elsewhere, artifacts of the Little Ice Age, where there was rapid pulse of sediment causing a disequilibrium condition, marsh expansion over tidal mudflats that hadn't existed before in the Holocene, followed by rapid retreat, return to closer to, I won't say equilibrium because I don't want to promulgate that idea right now, but a sort of a correction. And that's very different from our monitoring that's safely confined behind dikes, so you don't have to monitor the universe beyond the dike, and all you look at is vertical change. Now we know that that is not a safe assumption. These cores tell us we should be looking, I think, over deeper periods of time, and we should be looking for these thresholds, these changes or inflection points. These are things you should at least expect as an alternative hypothesis for how a restored marsh should change. And it seems to be the norm. There's not one core that shows really simple progressive change along that mudflat, low marsh, high marsh. It just doesn't, I mean, if it occurs, it's got to be the exception. If you go to some of the older marshes in the North Bay, China Camp, we've studied China Camp for ages about equilibrium channel, cross-sections of channels in relation to tidal prism. We really bought into the dynamic equilibrium story, the eternal pickleweed marsh plain. But if you look at the cores, again, this is from a different group. You see Davis, Frankie Malamud-Rome, and Lynn Ingram, and others. The cores at China Camp, there are a couple of publications, they show alternation of estuarine open bay mud, peaty muds, marsh, reversion to bay mud, peaty cores, missing layers, sand layers, at least 5 sand layers, showing mega floods or deluges with terrestrial inputs into extensive areas of marshes. These are processes we've kind of locked out of our field of view. And as we look towards the long-term future of restored tidal marshes, we probably need to accommodate the full range of processes, particularly the extreme climate events that appear to be associated with certainly the sand layers. That definitely is a deluge deposit or a bay overwash deposit. Of course, these cores don't really tell you too much about horizontal change, although they are suggestive that the bay mud layers do look a lot like clearing away of course, if there's a continuous core, you can't clear away the whole core, but it does suggest that horizontal instability, changing outer marsh shorelines, may be an important part of long-term marsh change. But we kind of lock that out almost administratively because we're working mostly behind dikes. If you look a little closer, think of this as sort of millennial monitoring that was done for us by pollen and diatoms and isotopes. This is what the real long-term record looks like over towards, let me see this side. You can see, again, that same alternation of peaty marsh soils followed by bay mud, another marsh episode, another bay mud episode with marsh. And now we can see from the pollen signatures that correspond to salinity indices based on a number of physical parameters like isotopes and some biological indicators like forams, that with salinity, major salinity fluctuations at different time scales, we've gone from this kind of historically unusual condition of pickleweed dominance to periods of prolonged brackish marsh that we'd expect in places like San Pablo Bay. Pickleweed was ascendant for long periods of prolonged droughts, but there were low periods where basically China Camp went to a brackish marsh. So setting goals and monitoring based on a presumed single climate-driven outcome is probably misguided. The norm for these long-term marsh evolutions seems to be a lot of fluctuation. Goals Project has brought in a whole new suite of concerns about marsh restoration that, again, have not necessarily gotten into the current generation of monitoring plans. Again, we focus most of our monitoring efforts on, marsh platform evolution, the marsh plain and low marsh. We're only now starting to emphasize monitoring of marsh edges as we design more marsh edge and place more resources at the edges, the transition zones, and also the eroding edges, the bay edges. That may become more of a need for allocating monitoring resources. The other focus of the goals project that should probably inform where we put monitoring in the future is focusing on those limiting habitats for the goals we are going to go forward with. A lot of the biological diversity conservation of tidal marshes is not uniformly distributed. If we're spending most of our resources monitoring marsh platforms, but most of the species are limited by only a portion of that marsh complex and not the middle part of the marsh, but the edges, either the channels, channel banks, the levees, and the transition zones, because, and maybe it's even only during brief phases of the year or the tides, maybe that is an indication of the need to reallocate monitoring from this sort of broad, comprehensive marsh platform perspective ending at the dikes to where the critical habitats are, and I'll show some examples over there. I've mentioned horizontal marsh instability. I'll show you some slides on that from San Francisco Estuary Institute. And another emphasis from the Goals Project is the importance of local watershed connections, not just ambient background salinities or total freshwater flows or total nutrient loads, but what local watersheds deliver to local marshes and restored marshes in terms of sediment yield and local freshwater discharges, both surface and subsurface, including groundwater. And here's very, very recent views of why some of these changes in emphasis and what we get with monitoring events. This is what it looks like on the ground. High marsh plain evolution and stability really don't account for those limiting factors during those extreme high tide flood events, which provide the key mortality vulnerability episodes for a lot of the species that we're restoring these marshes to conserve. This is a calm weather El Nino event in 2012, about over a half a foot over predicted tides. That's El Monte Boulevard, where the bay is cascading over the median, which is acting as sort of a dike, about almost a foot of water over the road. These events, which are not predicted, these are not astronomic tides, leave absolutely no high tide cover for resident marsh wildlife. There's a lot of marsh restoration in the Mill Valley area, and most of the projects are no longer monitored because they were presumed to have achieved their final equilibrium. They're being shifted. The marshes on the bay side of this flooded road are actually shifting back to cordgrass. Many of them had been pickleweed for decades, and now we're seeing, during these brief El Nino episodes, being driven episodically back to cordgrass. China Camp, one of the most mature marshes, one of the highest marsh plains, is now continuous open water surface, non-storm conditions. This has nothing to do with storm surge or low atmospheric pressure. These are just high sea level stands of El Ninos on top of perigee high tides. Former high tide habitats, for example, no longer monitored. These were terrestrial levees. You can see this is Buffine Marsh. These were oaks planted in the 1970s. About 3/4 of them are completely dead right now. The entire levee is submerged at high tides, under about 6 inches of water, and the top of it is saltgrass. These are things that had pretty much been assumed to reach some kind of equilibrium or gradual rise of sea level over long periods of time. But these El Nino events are changing all that. One of the key species for a lot of marsh plain planning and the monitoring that goes with it are ridgeways rails, formerly clapper rails. The limiting factor for clapper rail conservation in tidal marshes is often mortality events during high tides. Unfortunately, most of the monitoring effort for these clapper rail driven or ridgeway rail driven marshes is not for the events or the vegetation structure that provides the cover. It's on the general evolution of the marsh platform and channels that provide the presumed stable background. But if you were to take a look at the marsh, this is, by the way, not a bay. This is the marsh. This is the clapper rail marsh, now under completely submerged at high tide. There's no internal cover. All the gum plant, all the higher pickleweed is under about a foot of water. So this actually was a pretty good pace of marsh restoration there. It was a pretty successful project. But things are changing fast, and so there is now zero cover within the marsh, within the territories of clapper rails. Clapper rails are forced up along something that provided, this is technically high marsh. You can see the drift lines here. This is where the high water stands. I'll show you another photo of these where this entire entire bikeway is actually under a foot of water as well. But the clapper rails now are sort of roosting at high tide on top of rocks, walking back and forth, attracting predators. So the question is, what if you're doing monitoring or allocating monitoring resources, what should you be allocating it towards? Should you be focusing on marsh plain accretion? Is that the limiting factor? Or if you think the limiting factor is the high tide cover, maybe we can just sort of live with less information about the average conditions in the marsh plain and focus on the limiting factors. The thresholds here are the winter emergent salt marsh cover. This is, I'm going to emphasize salt marsh. So I'll look at Sassoon Marsh in a second and show a very different situation, which indicates that you can't use a standard monitoring protocol that fits the whole estuary. But the threshold clearly is the highest tides, not the high spring tides, but the highest tides of the year that cause significant submergence of the canopy, and the distribution and types of that high cover within the marsh complex. It's not enough to simply map the vegetation types and say, well, here's the map of gum plant that would provide that cover. You really need to know more about the structure of the high marsh, and particularly gum plant in this case. I'd also point out that after 3 years of drought, all the gum plant in this entire system has pretty much been reduced to skeletons. It's still present. There are seedlings, there are juveniles, but the structure that even monitoring of gum plant, the high tide refuge, is pretty much knocked out by the drought, and that's true in most of the South Bay marshes I visited. Only the youngest plants are retaining cover. So even the reliance on gum plant as high marsh cover, this is something monitoring plans need to pick up. We have to incorporate climate fluctuations, vegetation structure in parts of the marsh that were literally called peripheral marsh. The term of art in the 80s was, you know, there's the real salt marsh and then there's the peripheral halophyte zone. And it was only considered useful as long as there's some sort of crude cover. But the dynamics and structure of that peripheral halophyte zone may be one of the most important factors we have for conserving the listed species for which the restoration project and their monitoring was dedicated. Different situation in the North Bay and Sassoon. If we became wed to the idea of having a standardized monitoring protocol, we figured out Central Bay, South Bay, North Bay, we need to have these monitoring parameters based on gum plant. Look at Sassoon Marsh. This is Rush Ranch. This is photographed. I followed the tidal wave up. This is the perigee high tide in 2012. I just drove ahead of the tidal wave and compared, you know, Rush Ranch and the Marin marshes. You can see this is Muzzy Marsh, one of the oldest, most mature, most mature tidal marshes. That is the tidal marsh, the entire interior surface, which is built on dredge material to elevate the platform, completely, because of the vegetation structure, completely underwater. I don't think it's actively being monitored now, but the same tide, exactly the same tide, a few hours later for the wave to propagate up, in a different vegetation structure. This is also a mature marsh. This is a prehistoric marsh. You can see that not only is the high marsh plain cover, because of the vegetation structure, providing ample, uniformly distributed canopy cover, but the low marsh, because it's dominated by tules, bulrushes, the low marsh provides higher cover than the high marsh, which makes you wonder about why we emphasize monitoring high marsh elevations. I mean, it makes sense in salt marshes, but does it have the same species conservation impact in Sassoon Marsh? Probably you need to adjust the priorities of a monitoring plan for restoration based on vegetation structure. And that's not yet done. There's a lot of evidence from Department of Fish and Wildlife also on salt marsh harvest mouse in diked baylands. They're showing that mice are pretty much climbing up the tallest vegetation. So even some of the larger flood events in the diked baylands, they're responding much the way they would in the tidal marshes. They're just climbing what's tallest. So that does suggest that there is no single, tidal marsh monitoring template that's going to fit all these marshes over time. Here's Muzzy. Again, there is a long. I bring out Muzzy because not only is it one of the oldest tidal marsh. Let me check the time. How far am I? I can't see my. Okay, I'm not yet done yet. You can see right here this little split. That was a training berm. This is the old style 70s fill up to maximum engineered marsh platform elevation. You can see that was what was that lake surface. It was overfill, actually. So it was the highest marsh you get. But now, with 4 decades of sea level rise and lots of that dense cover of gum plant, this is an open water surface. Almost all the ridgeways rails are occupying this later phase where they lowered the elevations to allow for geomorphic evolution. This is where the clapper are concentrated. There is a lot of monitoring data, good monitoring data on vegetation and channel formation and sediments. For its day, those were the operative factors. Now there are other things changing. See these gray dots? First you might think those are hybrid Spartina invasions or something. Those are dead alkali bulrush. Alkali bulrush was a brackish marsh plant that was riding the wave of a couple of El Niños. They built up clonal populations, very inconspicuous when they're short, but they grew over the 97 El Nino event. We had several very wet years, not very conspicuous in the marsh. They were small, but they hung on till the 2006 El Nino. And after that very wet period, they expanded like an invasion. One thing about alkali bulrush is it provides a lot of high cover. So at the same time that gum plant was fading out, dead standing biomass, very tall alkali bulrush is coming in. None of these species changes were recorded in any of the monitoring period from the 80s or 90s. It was, you know, again, there's a shifting target for what's important to monitor. This is my blunt way of saying we really need to reevaluate constantly, not from a standard template, but you need to have the science feed back to the monitoring protocols, making standardization not the primary goal. Another thing, in addition to the changes that were documented, you know, here's a remnant old dike. Here's the old levee. There's the breach in the levee, made a tidal marsh. Well, no one was really studying horizontal marsh change all the years of just vertical change in the restored part, you know, the marsh platform. Well, now Baye erosion, a lot of San Rafael Bay and Corte Madera Bay is the mudflats themselves are showing signs of erosion, profiles going concave. Now those levees are completely caving in. We're actually, the base of the levee is on old marsh peat, and the levees are on top of the marsh peat. The whole thing's starting to shift over to another kind of profile with a different level of resistance. This is rapidly placed Bay mud. Its shear strength is not as high as those old consolidated peats. So once you cross this profile, one thing you might notice over here, for every foot or two of retreat over where there's a levee and old marsh profile still there, there's about 50, 60 feet here. Well, when this whole bayward scarp goes, you might see a step change in horizontal marsh retreat that's just not been on anyone's monitoring plan because we've all kind of passively relied on levees. That either leaves you with the options of forced engineering, armoring every marsh we build, which has a lot of problems. I won't go into those from a design standpoint, but it eliminates processes that help the marsh stay high if you armor them and prevent waves from building up sediment during storms. Or the alternative, you might have to face very accelerated retreat when all these soft marshes start to get exposed to wave energy. These are rapidly built, instantaneously built marshes, very low shear strength. So this is something that's just not been on our monitoring radar, but I suggest as sea level rises, the bay deepens, and wave energy increases, we should be looking at the changes in the behavior of these marsh edges and not just assuming levees are where levees are. It has a connection for this, yes. Again, this is why all we have in the interior of this is that restored muggy marsh. It was not submerging like this all through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. This is a new phenomenon. And again, and the idea of focusing monitoring on the limiting processes or the limiting habitat structures, looking at relatively recent marsh, this is the early stages of Carl's Marsh. This is Cogswell Marsh, one of the older restored tidal marshes in the East Bay. One of the legacies we have in these early marshes where the focus for both design and monitoring was only on achieving elevations and cover. There is no study of species diversity or the structural diversity that comes with species diversity. So we've inherited our massive plains of fast colonizing species that dominate extensive areas, we have really, even though the goals project area, we place value on the species diversity, we have no history of monitoring data that shows whether we are conserving species diversity in these restored marshes. One good example as a test that, again, was not part of the monitoring of Muzzy Marsh. Muzzy Marsh was restored. Let me go back a couple. This is Hairt Marsh. This is California Department of Fish and Wildlife. This is one of those prehistoric marsh remnants, and it's pretty species rich. Has a very large population, very persistent, of this salt marsh birdsbeak, which the type locality was San Francisco Bay, where it's close to extinct. And in the 40 years that it's had the ability to disperse into potentially suitable habitat, no one's seen it, nor is anyone monitoring for it. And there's a whole suite of mostly annual species like these. These are some goldfields, some other hemiparasitic salt marsh olive plovers. These are almost extirpated in the Bay. There's no evidence that they're dispersing, that in any way benefiting from tidal marsh restorations. Possibly they are in a few places, but monitoring has not been set up to detect things that were not part of the actual design. If no one's actively bringing these species in or getting credits for them or checking off their permit checklist, the monitoring is not generating that data. That's 40 years of data omission. That's something we really, now that we do have goals for this at a regional level, we may need to make specific requirements for including these in monitoring plans. Otherwise, we will continue to have largely homogeneous marshes. Another aspect of the kind of rigid blinkers on for playing to the permit criteria for monitoring plans is that sometimes we do things in marsh restoration projects that you don't anticipate that may be more valuable, especially going into the future with sea level rise and climate change accelerating, more valuable than the original goals of the project. I'm going to jump on this one. Almost every project that uses dredge material, the goal is to spread the dredge material out within limits of tolerance, not to exceed those tolerances, not to fall short, and use it as a platform on which natural processes build the final marsh. That's been the standard for decades, and that was a good idea, especially after the lessons learned from Muzzy Marsh. So again, the unintended consequences of Muzzy Marsh sort of escaped monitoring the first time, but then generated the next generation of marsh designs. Well, Sonoma Baylands was considered the second generation, the flagship for the new 90s restoration style, and both at Sonoma Baylands and at Montezuma, which was about its contemporary, where you had point discharges from the dredge pipes, you'd develop, as you might expect, the coarsest sediments, the silts, and the coarser silts and the sands would drop out and form these deltaic splays or sediment fans. This is Port of Oakland sand and a little bit of oyster shell, might be middens, who knows. And they made these high elevation splays that were not to spec. The engineers did not like them because they exceeded the tolerances of the elevations. And again, the goal was to make a marsh plain, a platform on which channels would snake, and then it ended at the levee. Well, now, of course, we can look back at this and think that, okay, high marsh transition zones, supertidal transition zones, broad, gently sloping areas with dense vegetation dissipating wave energy, species diversity in those transition zones. These are things we actually can make use of now. We have no, after 20 years of restoration at Sonoma Baylands and the construction period of Montezuma, we have absolutely no data on this. I talked to the engineers, trying to get these data. They actually said, well, these weren't to spec, so we graded them down until they just met spec. And then we didn't want to, as long as they were within the limits of error, we didn't need any information on them. So again, off-spec, off-brand, no data. But these were huge assets. They're, in some ways, ecological capital for the challenges of restoration in the next decade. But unfortunately, we have no monitoring basis to learn from how they evolved other than reconstructing their evolution from aerial photographs. But it was pretty clear that these were emulating natural processes and structures. Here they are. Here's the back of the North Levee. You can see each little lobe of the fan was these are all points where the dredge pipe was moved. They also had little craters which made beautiful marsh pans, which are now, of course, valued as part of restoration design. No information because, again, it was outside the spec of the monitoring plan's physical evolution, and also because there were transect monitoring for vegetation. These, of course, fell outside the transects. Why would you locate the transects where they don't show typical? Typical may not be very interesting. What it did show me, this is right behind Sonoma Baylands. It's kind of ironic. This is one of the only active alluvial fans connecting right to Baylands in the whole estuary. It's right behind Sonoma Baylands. And Sonoma Baylands was doing an almost perfect imitation of this process, which was the 2006 El Nino. These fans would normally deposit the platforms for high marsh and transition zones at the back of the marsh, ahead of sea level. I mean, the highest tides don't deposit much suspended sediment, but terrestrial processes have no trouble providing these gentle gradients. So we have no data on this, the setting, the terrestrial setting, and we have no data on this, the analog. But we do have, this is China Camp. This is one of the 5, thanks. I'll speed along here or skip some stuff. This natural process, China Camp is probably, Mike will agree, you run the NER, this is one of the most studied or overstudied marshes in the area, but no one was studying this little terrestrial sedimentation process, which we know now is really critical for making these restoration projects survive sea level rise. Well, here's the long-term evolution. This is like only actually 10 years. Here's the dredge pipe hits, here are the fans. 10 years later, massive areas of gum plant grading down to pickleweed, grading down to cordgrass. At the time, you can see all the shallow open water. For other reasons, Sonoma Baylands was kind of stalled. It had sort of an arrested development for a period. So most of the highest order objectives were being achieved right on these non-spec features where we have a monitoring blackout. They really were pretty spectacular. They produced the only really extensive high marsh terrestrial ecotones in the project site, largest expansions of gum plant. I'm going to jump to another thing that was not monitored at Sonoma Baylands or anywhere else. Sonoma Baylands generated great data. I'm suggesting that we may need to refocus the most valuable parts of that. Another example of where we need to refocus is on wind wave erosion and instability of tidal marsh edges. Globally, there's a lot of recent evidence suggesting that it's not, even though vertical instability, falling behind sea level, drowning into low marsh, or maybe drowning into flats, it's an issue. But worldwide, horizontal instability, lateral treated marshes, is a larger source of salt marsh loss. Back in '79, Atwater gave some crude map estimates of net erosion in different parts of the bay. First warning, a lot of the bay was net retreating. North Bay, there were pockets of marsh expansion. Maybe that's an important thing for selecting restoration sites. This was ignored. No one cited Atwater through all the 90s. SFEI took very recently, Julie Beagle and her team went back and compared the historic patterns of marsh shoreline change. This is the long period, 1855 to 93. World safe for tidal marsh restoration, lots of net change, progradation, few erosion hotspots where old marshes are cropping out into the bay, making headlands. Most of the bay looks fine. This is where most of our restoration projects were planned. No one would monitor the outside of a restoration project because you take it for granted. It's safe. And here's Richmond. That looks like a bad place to restore marshes back in that period. But now look at what they picked up after the goals project period. This is 1993 to 2010, complete reversion. Only the tip of Mare Island is showing a strong net progradation change. There's actually a little bit of some progradation spots, but it's slowing down. But most of the exterior marshes are undergoing now rapid retreat. This is, again, the environmental setting dictates the way project sites work. Our old 70s, 80s, 90s habit of only monitoring within your site is something that may come back to bite us. Again, at worst, it could result in reactive armoring of shorelines to keep things the same when you see change, or it could also be used as a guide to where we put our resources. Here's some examples of those retreating edges. These are the prehistoric marshes at Midshipman's Point, Tole Creek, eroding a couple meters a year. And even though we have an erosional signal here, this is still a net progradation profile. This is actually very similar to parts of Grizzly Bay, Tule Red is a very similar structure where the marsh is prograding and growing above mean higher water elevations because of wave deposition. This is actually a different marsh forming process here. Again, unstudied. Maybe have some opportunities. All right, I probably need to check on time. Getting close to Q. I'll just run through the point of this. This is, again, learning from the lessons of a couple other marshes, Sonoma Baylands and Carl's Marsh. This is Sears Point out by the mouth of the Petaluma River. We have always sort of looked at monitoring vegetation change on marsh platforms as sort of a homogeneous process. You just measure net cover, total aggregate cover, but not the pattern of colonization or the patterns of coalescence or what initiates marsh or where it initiates. Is it from the edge? Where's my little cursor that grows out? Is it from these points? So in this case, we've created new designs that try to nucleate points where marshes will establish by creating rough high spots and expecting the clonal growth patterns to spread out. That suggests we're engineering a new pattern of colonization, suggests a new way of requiring data from going from transects in the old days, little linear slices, very low information, very low sampling intensity, to more comprehensive aerial photo analysis of marsh spread rates with a little bit of field checking to look at the patterns and processes. That's the design. The design itself kind of indicates what the monitoring should be: marsh progradation, rhizome elongation rates, and the distribution of these points. Are we getting colonization between these elevated mounds that are designed as seedling nurseries? Is all of the marsh restoration occurring only at these mounds? If that's the case, that suggests that this kind of design, this speckled marsh mound design at Sears Point, here's Sonoma Baylands, 20 years old, still mostly mudflat and marsh transition to mudflat. Big change in pace the last couple of years, really picked up pace, but still well beyond the, where's the photo there? This is the 10-year forecast for Sonoma Baylands. The different processes were dominating it. A couple other different processes. This is, again, one of the marsh mounds that was up and tested, built in 2008 at Baye. And this one was not actively vegetated, but it did exactly what was predicted. The only place in the marsh interior where there is marsh radial progradation, pickleweed, gum plant, marsh edge of cordgrass spreading into the adjacent mudflats, the only place we see it is along the fringes and on these marsh mounds. This may be a way of triggering marsh evolutionary processes rather than just waiting for it to happen. So one thing you can do is develop testable hypotheses and build the monitoring around those hypotheses. So you get conclusive data as opposed to sort of feeling the trend data or performance evaluation. Another point on monitoring unexpected outcomes, this isn't even the restoration phase, but it affects the restoration phase. How many projects have monitoring plans to monitor these long waits, these 20-year waits like Montezuma or 15-year waits like Hamilton? Monitoring tends not to evaluate changes in the baseline conditions. Here's one example that really suggests why. This is Bahia in Novato. It was a diked bayland used as pasture. Pumps broke 1 year. Water control structures broke. It flooded. Doesn't make a difference because we're going to restore it in 2 years anyway. Well, in those 2 years, 150 years of accreted organic matter in warm, brackish water built up massive amounts of sulfur-reducing bacteria feeding on the organics. This red is iron oxide, which chemically reflects the amount of iron sulfide being produced and oxidizes to iron oxide. This is a massive acid pit, and it was the grading. Here's the outcomes. This the entire surface of the interior bayland was pretty much crusted with iron oxide, in some cases metallic iron and elemental sulfur, native sulfur. No one measured pH, no one monitors that stuff, and this is one of the early horizontal levees. This is not a wet one. This doesn't have any water trickling through it, but it's like a 20-to-1 levee we built from old dredge material, old dredge bay mud. 5 years later, looks like it was planted, absolutely 100% cover, structurally very sound, same age, levees, similar grade, but borrowed from these acid sulfates, sulfate barrens, unvegetated, and you cannot, I mean, it wouldn't tell you more to measure the cover over again. It's the process. There's no measuring of soil quality. I probably need to skip this. Just one last unexpected outcome I'll point to, if I could, just bear with me. Sonoma Baylands, again, good goals, clapper rail habitat, as in the day, clapper rail ridgeways now, salt marsh mouse habitat, wanted to maximize marsh, minimize mudflat, get it done as fast as possible, and the measurements fit it. This is predicted. This is the initial condition of Sonoma Baylands. There was tidal choking for 2 points. I'll leave the other story. There were 2 points of tidal choking, one here and one here. But for the first 5 years or so, it became a microtidal lagoon. It was flooded at all tidal stages. That was not the goal. There was no monitoring of anything other than mudflat and marsh, because that was the model, right? Well, what happened to it? We developed like a couple hundred acres of submerged aquatic habitat, of submerged aquatic vegetation. Rupia marinima, people see it, they think it's algae. It's a submerged vascular plant. If you look at we did have monitoring. I wasn't doing the monitoring, but the Corps of Engineers through PWA and Jules Evans, they monitored the birds. They were expecting shorebirds, rapid shorebird invasion of new mudflats. They got were pintail numbers that would be, Steve, the envy of any Sassoon Duck Club. It was shallow open water, SAV, which was one of the old styles of managing duck clubs way back in the day, mostly with sago pondweed. This one didn't have sago, it was too saline for sago, but we had hundreds of acres of effectively a new ecosystem, an alternate state of that tidal marsh. Zero data, no measurement. This is what the surface looked like. You could not miss it. I mean, during most of the year, it was a solid sheet of rapidly expanding rupia, ducks dabbling through chironomid midges, not so much seeds, a lot of invertebrates in there. To the shore, it would wash up and produce huge amounts of organic matter, hard to miss. Not on the list, not on the approved list. So here's the significance for Sassoon. We have a lot of reached basins subsided. Their initial state would probably be, if there's an accidental breach, probably be an SAV habitat. At the same time, the estuary's background condition is clearing. We're getting a sudden clearing of the estuaries. Suspended sediments are dropping, and they are not coming back. And what we're seeing now, this is the mouth of Montezuma, a new kind of marsh succession. The exterior, this is outside of Montezuma, the tidal areas, these are tules. We expect mudflats, tule succession, more tule, higher marsh. What's happening now is tules are co-dominant with a still unresolved species of Stuckenia, a native one. This is probably like a giant fluvial phenotype of sago pondweed. It grows 10, 15 feet long, massive, wave tolerant, and it's colonizing these low areas. This is something we might want, if something is not restorable as a tidal marsh, there may be very valuable ecosystem functions from this kind of system, but we have no monitoring for it. I will leave the other parts of the story because, as expected, I've got to the limits. I can just point to other things. There's some things about unplanned patterning. This is the basis of marsh mounds if people want to ask questions afterwards. And some of the interior bayland constraints on tidal circulations, again, off monitoring. So in case anyone's curious about those, I can come back to these. And there's some shoreline stuff. Sorry for not staying within my bounds, but, and I'm not sure there's time for questions officially, but I'd be willing to stay if they're unofficial. I rarely finish.
It is on. I was just curious about the cost of this kind of monitoring that you're proposing. It seems like you need a well-staffed people that understand system and state change and all these things. And for a lot of current monitoring funds seem to be lacking. And so how do we move
It's
forward?
a question of how you spread them. Actually, I'm by nature a little thrifty. I really would rather see monitoring nimbly reallocated to where it matters most, which means letting go of some of the continuity of some data when they prove less informative. Like maybe you can shift from, in other words, we usually have sort of a permit-driven plan where you get it approved by the agencies and there's a cost to it, and then you work within that cost, and anything you add to it is an addition, so the cost goes up. One way of doing this is perhaps to have something like a technical advisory group to reevaluate the whole monitoring plan and say, how could we reallocate within budget? I do this, if this is one of the slides, thanks for getting me over there, like when we have like a 5-year monitoring plan, which tells you next to nothing about ecological trajectories or succession, and the client says, we only have money for 5 years because that's what we got permitted for. How about if we spread that 5 years of effort over 25 years, and we pick critical years, or maybe we call years, like based on when there's an El Nino event or a drought year. So you kind of adjust it to capture data rather than to set it up so it's a regular sampling plan. You sort of do kind of, I wouldn't say reactive, but adaptive monitoring to capture events. Like if I have a 20-year monitoring plan and it's done at 3-year intervals, I would want to definitely have them capture droughts or the year after a drought or an El Nino year. I wouldn't want them to follow a standard protocol. If I have if I have 15 transects, which are labor intensive, and then someone gets really good at remote sensing and hyperspectral imagery resolution that can tell the difference between alkali bulrush and cordgrass, I'll say, drop the transects. Let's do all imagery and get the same parameters from that. You have to have someone with responsibility, the authority, and the expertise in the same room talking to each other to make those decisions. My experience, I'm a little cynical on adaptive management as practice. I know it's done well in some projects, but so often there's this inertia. Well, that's the way it was approved. That's the way our permit says. This is the agreement. This is our budget, and deviating that's a cost. So it really comes down to the way we administer monitoring plans. I don't think it necessarily has to meet a line item increase. We have to also be willing to let go of some things when they're judged to be less informative than the new stuff we didn't expect.